this movie represents two opposite arguments, I think. One is to always think it different, that everything is just change, that ideas are sort of only in our heads. And then we get, for example, the guy who's talking about how the teacup is, everybody sees it different and it's all good, that we all see it differently. And then at the end, you're talking about what premises do we want to maintain? Where do we draw the lines? How do you make things come out good as compared to bad? I wonder if you could say something about that relationship between constancy and flexibility. And then until we do figure out how to deal with that, we'll tend to use those self-servingly. I'll tend to say, I'm principled, but you're stubborn. I'm flexible, but you're flaky.
I think that's part of the game, isn't it? I mean, it's structured, but it's unstructured. In the end, it boils down to who you are and the way you handle things. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I don't think there is an answer, except for to cultivate and to appreciate whatever dignity and integrity we can. The beauty. I think that aesthetic question comes in probably foremost in what you're discussing here. There's a level of ethics that comes in, and that is maybe best not in a formula, maybe best not laid down in some sort of strict and rigid way of what makes it right and what makes it wrong, what makes me flexible and you flaky. Yeah.
There's suffering in the world. Your father was very conscious of suffering. What he talked about with respect to his thinking was to address the suffering in the world. So purpose, right, is more than something of embracing correct thinking. It's also saying if I do not address suffering, I do not address correct thinking. And you're not speaking about that, and you didn't speak about that in the film, and I'm curious about that. Because there's no purpose, in my mind, to enjoy the genius of your father if we do not address the suffering in the world. We must come out of this with purpose. Just walking out of here as intellectual cyberneticians, enjoying the fruits of our dialogue for the next 5 days without addressing the suffering in the world, to me, I think, questions our own ethics. I'd like you to respond to that. It is about ethics.
It is about ethics. And ultimately, it's about caring. And that I did address. It's something that is really, I think, evident in everything that Gregory wrote and everything that he did. That there is a deep and profound caring, looking for the integrity and the dignity of very complex systems and how to protect those interdependencies. My mother has this beautiful story about the first time that she heard Gregory speak and the way he spoke about schizophrenics, because it was the first time she'd ever heard anyone speak about them with so much care and love and dignity. And you can't begin to engage in any kind of purpose to relieve suffering without that caring. And there are lots of attempts to address suffering from one action or another that actually lead to more suffering. T.S. Eliot said, lest one good idea should ruin the world. There's purpose, and I think all of us come here because we're concerned, deeply concerned. So it's tricky, it's very tricky. But let that not make us feel paralyzed to do nothing. So finding a balance within that is a task. Yeah.
I see a relation between Jeremy's question and Eli's and your response in the sense that we are careful not to specify a particular distinction, a particular way of framing something that creates a specific that we are then going to say, this is it, that we can claim as superiority knowledge or that this is the right way. But if we can then allow the fluidity of seeing the relationships as they're changing, as they are necessarily dynamic, and being willing to make new distinctions, and without even distinguishing the relationship as a something, without giving it a particular name that we shall now uphold this and this is our purpose. But in the living forth of it, being aware that the care and the ethical behavior is the relevance that we wish to conserve, then it becomes a conservation in a different dimension than that which we have already distinguished as a thing. And that's how I see myself resolving that dilemma between conservation and change.
Desires.
I was thinking that perhaps we should reflect on the nature of our problem. Problems are always conflicts of desires. We want A and we want B, but if we have A, we can't have B, and vice versa. And I think that in a way it is we human beings which are the living problem. Because among all the living beings existing, we human beings care. We human beings care for others. We are concerned for what happens to others. We want their well-being. But at the same time, we want to be ourselves, to grow, to become richer, to become more powerful. And these are conflicting things. We cannot have care and at the same time wanting to become more strong, more rich.
I guess another part of the question is when you're looking for the suffering and what's causing the suffering. I mean, I guess that's sort of what's behind addressing suffering, is the search for what's making it happen. In that process, you come to the question of sort of, my sister Mary Catherine brings it up, so where's the pathology? Is it in me? Is it in you? Is it possible when you start to focus on the dynamics of a complex system, is it possible to place that blame? How do we begin to look at causation in a complex system, of finding where is the pathology? And maybe what we're looking for in addressing this question of dealing with suffering is not so much what is the suffering, but what are the patterns that are creating the suffering? At what level have things stabilized in toxic relationships? Which relationships are creating it? And how do we begin to destabilize that in different ways?
If fluctuation control, how one thing flows into another without having to need causality or violence. How things do flow into one another. Transformation, it's called, mutation, their words. How did that happen? You need cybernetics.
Gregory Bateson had written an article about evolution and the theory of evolution. And in that article, he had made very clear that the theory of evolution is not a causal theory, but it is a theory that works by constraints. And it was that made me realize that indeed that seemed the most salient characteristic of cybernetics, that it is interested in constraints and not in causes. And the interest in constraints means that you learn to sort of cope with constraints by finding other possibilities that don't conflict with the constraints.
I think as a cybernetician, I would say at some point we need to reveal the linguistic basis of these stuckness. For example, as I said, free speech and money is not the same. And if you go back to the founding fathers, they had never thought that to allow that to be confused. They thought free speech is, well, an individual can say what he wants. But so I think, to me, the issue of language is what connects us, actually. It's not me, you, but how we speak.
The first gentleman at the back, the question about the purpose of purpose, if you will, I think is unbelievable. It's a very quick way for this conference to center on something very fundamental. if I get this right, then the central idea of Buddhism hinges on the idea of suspending desire, i.e. a sense of purpose, so as to end suffering, which is exactly what this comes down to. And in that sense, I think we are all finding ourselves in a double bind, in the sense that what is right and what is wrong. Is it right or is it wrong to address or not to address purpose in a portrayal of Bateson? Is it right or is it wrong, as the intellectual, academic cyberneticians, to have no purpose and to play with these things just intellectually? I would say at the core of this very provocative question is maybe a problem with framing things in terms of either being right or being wrong. Maybe that's already a step in a problematic direction.
Just a clarification, I do not see desires the same as having purpose. Desires are very different for me than purpose. What I need and want is design and what I desire in relation to others and what they desire.
But don't worry, Sprint will fulfill all.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm speaking of desire in a very different way, and I'm speaking it in my experience of 20 years of coming to the American Society for Cybernetics, and that is how I speak about and want to speak about desires. So it's important to make the distinction between desire and purpose. I desire peace is a need.
My desire, Leo, false statement. I live a praxis of deliberate thinking that rubs against premises and assumptions of paradigms gone by. Bye.
Sure, there are a million questions you do.
This is just some housekeeping. Could you explain to people what you mean by a false statement, which you used a few times there?
False statement is something you desire to be true but isn't yet true, so you make a false statement. First you come to what you desire, and then out of that one can come to false statements about their desires. Peace is a need. So then I would look to Larry and say, what would be the next sentence?
So the next statement would be, conflict is a necessity.
Peace is a need, so conflict is a necessity. Let's have a conversation. Now, I'd like to just say one more word about conversation. I come from a school of thought and a school for designing a society that talks about conversations as beginning as asynchronicities. So if peace is a need, so conflicts are necessity, so we take our conflicts as a starting point, as invitations to generate something new. The old paradigm says conflict equals fight, war, violence, blah, 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 blah. I was involved in the Occupy movement. That's why I do this. If any of you don't know, this is like an Occupy movement. This means you agree with what's being said. And then I went to the School for Designing Society, and they said, well, no, we can't have it be agree. You have to do something more that shows you're thinking about it, not just giving over your agreement to the idea. And then this is sort of like, you don't agree with what's being said. Just to give you a little lesson in General Assembly Occupy, at least in the United States. So conversations are opportunities to generate something new. And as a performer of daily life, I desire to generate conversations. Okay, Susan?